On the night of November 3, 1961, a Soviet signals technician named Mikhail Orlov transmitted a message that should not have existed. It described an event that had not yet happened, in a place he had never been, to people he had never met. 3 days later, every word of it came true. Then Mikhail Orlov disappeared, and the file documenting what he heard was sealed for 31 years. This is the story they tried to erase. Station 9, known to the men who served there simply as The Edge, sat 200 kilometers north of the nearest railway, buried in the birch and pine wilderness of central Siberia. It was not marked on any public map. Officially, it did not exist. Its purpose was to listen, to the static between frequencies, to the encrypted chatter drifting across the Arctic from NATO ships and American bases in Alaska, to anything that moved through the air and might, someday, matter. Mikhail Orlov was 26 years old when he arrived at The Edge in the late spring of 1961. He was not a soldier in the traditional sense. He held the rank of junior lieutenant in the Signals Corps, but his file described him, with the flat precision the Soviet bureaucracy reserved for its most useful men, as an exceptional listener. He had perfect pitch. He could distinguish by ear alone 17 distinct varieties of radio interference, and he had once identified a malfunctioning valve in a receiver 3 rooms away simply by the faint whine it produced. His superiors did not entirely understand what made him so good at his job. They only knew that he was. He was also, by every account that survives him, a deeply cautious man. Colleagues described him as reserved almost to the point of coldness, meticulous in his logs, contemptuous of superstition. He had lost his older brother Pavel in the defense of Stalingrad 19 years earlier, a death that, according to a fellow officer's later testimony, Mikhail rarely spoke of but never seemed to fully set down. Some said this loss had made him rigid, unwilling to trust anything that could not be measured, timed, or written into a logbook. It is one of the great ironies of his story that a man so devoted to hard fact would become the center of an event that defied every rule he believed in. The Edge housed 19 men that autumn. Life there followed a punishing rhythm. 6-hour listening shifts in a windowless concrete room lined with vacuum tube receivers, followed by long stretches of enforced idleness in a barracks where the temperature outside could fall below -40 degrees Celsius. The isolation was total. Mail arrived once a month, if the roads allowed it. There was no way in or out except by military transport, and transport came only when Moscow decided it should. Imagine, for a moment, the particular pressure of that isolation. 19 men, thousands of kilometers from anyone who loved them, listening for months to nothing but the hiss of empty frequencies, waiting for a war that everyone quietly believed might begin any day. It was into this pressure cooker silence that something began to speak. According to the recovered station log, declassified in 1992 and later authenticated by independent Russian historians, the anomaly began on the night of October 22, 1961, during Mikhail's overnight shift. He was monitoring a standard sweep of shortwave bands when, at 2:47 a.m., he logged what he described only as an intrusion. Not a voice, not code. A rhythmic pulse, buried beneath the static of a frequency that, by every technical standard of the era, should have carried nothing at all. It repeated in patterns of 7, then 11, then 13, prime numbers, spaced with mathematical precision that no natural interference could produce. He woke his supervising officer, Captain Dmitry Sokolov, a hardened veteran who had little patience for junior lieutenants reporting ghosts in the wires. Sokolov listened for 4 minutes, dismissed it as equipment failure, and ordered Mikhail to file a maintenance request and return to his post. The pulse returned the following night. and the night after that. By the fourth night, it was no longer a pulse. It was a voice, faint, layered beneath heavy distortion, speaking in a cadence that several of the men who later heard the recordings described as wrong, though none could articulate precisely why. It spoke in Russian. It used Mikhail's name. What it said next was recorded, transcribed, and, according to the log, immediately flagged for review by Station Command. The transcription survives in the Declassified file. On the 6th of November, the dam at Kirensk will fail. 41 will not leave the valley. Nothing about that sentence made sense to anyone at the station. There was no dam at Kirensk on any Soviet infrastructure record available to Station 9. There was no reason for a mysterious frequency to warn a listening post, of all places, about a civil engineering disaster nearly 600 kilometers away. Captain Sokolov's official response, preserved in his own handwriting in the margin of the log, was blunt. Enemy disinformation, or a man losing his mind. Watch him. But something in Mikhail Orlov would not let it go. He was not a man who believed in omens, and yet he could not explain what he had heard, could not replicate the frequency through any deliberate signal, and could not silence the growing unease that had settled over the station's night shift, where more than one man now refused to work alone. There was, in fact, a hydroelectric containment structure under construction near Kirensk, a project so recent, so poorly documented outside a narrow circle of regional engineers that Station 9 had no record of it at all. This detail would only surface later, once investigators went looking for it. At the time, it was simply impossible. A young lieutenant in a sealed listening post with no access to civil engineering schedules could not have known the dam existed, let alone that it carried a structural flaw serious enough to fail. On November 6, 1961, at approximately 4:15 in the afternoon, a support wall at the Kirensk containment structure gave way under early winter ice pressure. Water surged through a narrow agricultural valley below. The official casualty count, filed by regional authorities and later cross-referenced by historians, was 41 dead. 41. The exact number Mikhail had transcribed 2 weeks earlier. At Station 9, the reaction was not celebration or awe. It was fear. Captain Sokolov, according to the testimony of 2 surviving crew members interviewed decades later, ordered the log entries sealed and forbade further discussion of the incident among the men. Mikhail himself, they said, grew visibly withdrawn, eating alone, sleeping little, spending his off hours re-listening to recordings that, according to the technical logs, should have been nothing but static. But the voice was not finished with him. Over the following 2 weeks, the transmissions grew more frequent. They no longer arrived only at night. They no longer confined themselves to a single frequency. Mikhail began hearing fragments of the pulse even when he was not on duty. In the barracks, he told a fellow soldier named Grigory Panov, in the ringing silence just before sleep. Panov's account, given in a 1994 interview to a Russian journalist researching Cold War signals anomalies, is one of the few first-person testimonies to survive. He described Mikhail as a changed man in those final weeks, hollow-eyed, obsessively rewriting the same transcriptions, convinced that the voice was not warning them of accidents at all, but of something it called the correction. When Panov asked what that meant, Mikhail reportedly said only, "It says the future already happened. It says we are the ones still catching up." On November 19th, the voice delivered a second, far more specific message, one that named, according to the surviving transcript, an individual by rank and surname stationed at a naval facility in Murmansk, and predicted the date and manner of an equipment failure aboard a vessel that would, days later, be confirmed to have occurred almost exactly as described. This was no longer something Captain Sokolov could bury in a drawer. 2 verified predictions, delivered by a junior officer at an isolated listening post, both involving casualties, both impossible to have obtained through any conventional channel. Moscow was notified, and Moscow, in the particular manner of a government terrified of losing control of a narrative, did not send scientists. It sent the KGB. 2 officers arrived at Station 9 by military transport on November 24, 1961. Their names do not appear in any surviving personnel record, a deliberate omission, historians now believe, meant to erase the visit entirely. What is known comes from Panov's testimony and from a handful of oblique references in later Soviet counterintelligence memos that surfaced during the 1990s archive releases. The officers interrogated Mikhail for 11 hours. They confiscated every recording, every logbook page, every handwritten transcription he had made. They interviewed each of the 19 men at the station individually, asking not whether the predictions were real, but whether Mikhail Orlov could have obtained the information through espionage, whether he was, in their words, receiving instruction rather than transmission. It was an accusation that made a strange, cold sense within the paranoid architecture of the Cold War. Better to believe a man was a spy relaying prearranged signals than to believe that something had reached through the static and spoken a truth no human source could have possessed. Mikhail denied it. He had nothing to confess. He offered, instead, to demonstrate, to sit at the receiver, in front of the officers and wait for the voice to return. They allowed it. And according to Panov, who was ordered to stand watch outside the listening room that night, something did return. Panov could not hear the words. He could only hear Mikhail's voice, rising and falling as though in conversation. And beneath it, faint through the door, a low, rhythmic tone that made the hair on his arms stand on end. When the officers emerged before dawn, their faces, Panov said, were not the faces of men who had caught a spy. They were the faces of men who had heard something they could not file a report about. Mikhail Orlov was taken from Station 9 that morning. He was never seen there again. For 31 years, that was where the trail ended. No court record, no transfer order, no death certificate. Mikhail Orlov's file, along with the classified logs of Station 9, was sealed under a designation that historians would later learn meant the material was considered too destabilizing to release even to senior military archivists, a classification typically reserved not for state secrets, but for incidents the state itself could not explain or control. His mother, who lived in Sverdlovsk, received a single letter from the Ministry of Defense in early 1962. It stated only that her son had died in the course of his duties, and that the circumstances were classified. No remains were returned. No grave exists bearing his name. For 3 decades, the story of Station 9 survived only as rumor among former Soviet signals personnel, a whispered footnote in a world already saturated with official secrets. It might have vanished entirely, the way so many Cold War ghosts did, had the Soviet Union not collapsed in 1991, taking with it the machinery that had kept the file locked. In 1992, in the chaotic scramble to declassify and catalog decades of Soviet military records, a partial file bearing the designation of Station 9 surfaced in a regional archive outside Novosibirsk. It was incomplete. Pages were missing. Several transcriptions had been redacted with heavy black ink that had since faded to gray, but enough remained to confirm what former station personnel had claimed for years: the Kirensk warning, the Murmansk equipment failure, and at least 4 other predictions whose outcomes could no longer be verified because the events themselves had been erased from public record. Researchers who examined the recovered log noted something else, buried in the final pages before the file broke off entirely. In the last entry attributed to Mikhail Orlov, dated the night before the KGB officers arrived, He had written a single, unfinished line, different from his usual precise, clinical hand. It does not want to hurt us. It says the warnings are a mercy. It says most stations never get one. The sentence ends there. What followed, whether Mikhail wrote more, whether pages were removed, whether he was interrupted mid-thought, no one can say. The file offers no further entries under his name. In the years since the archive's partial release, researchers and historians have proposed explanations ranging from the mundane to the extraordinary. And, just as with every great unsolved mystery of the era, none of them account for every detail. Theory 1. Espionage. Some intelligence historians maintain the simplest explanation, that Mikhail was, knowingly or not, a conduit for information smuggled through covert channels, perhaps by a source inside Soviet infrastructure ministries, feeding him advance warning through an untraceable numbers station method. This would explain the accuracy of the predictions, but offers no account for the eerie, voice-like quality reported by multiple witnesses, nor for why anyone would risk exposing a spy network merely to warn about a dam failure. Theory 2. Psychological strain and coincidence. Isolation, sleep deprivation, and the extraordinary sensory sensitivity that made Mikhail so valuable as a listener may have combined to produce both genuine pattern detection in ordinary static and a kind of self-reinforcing delusion within the tightly wound culture of Station 9. Under this theory, the Kirensk prediction may have originated from a genuine, half-remembered fragment of engineering gossip picked up through legitimate signals traffic, later mythologized by frightened, exhausted men into something supernatural. Theory 3. Undocumented signals technology. A minority of researchers have suggested that Station 9 may have inadvertently intercepted an experimental, highly classified Soviet or foreign transmission system, one using frequency patterns advanced enough, in 1961, to seem inexplicable, and important enough that its discovery by a low-ranking officer would justify an immediate and total cover-up. Theory 4. Something else. And then there are the explanations that resist the language of engineering and espionage altogether. The possibility, taken seriously by no official body, but whispered persistently among those who have studied the case, that what reached Mikhail Orlov through the static was neither human transmission nor delusion, but something that should not have been able to reach him at all. None of these theories explain why the predictions were always exact. None explain the KGB's reaction, an intelligence apparatus infamous for punishing failure, not silence, choosing instead to erase a man who had apparently succeeded at something no one could name. And none explain the final line in his own handwriting, insisting that what he had heard did not wish him harm. Today, Station 9 no longer exists in any operational form. Satellite images show only a cluster of collapsed concrete structures reclaimed by birch forest, accessible by a single overgrown logging road. A handful of Russian paranormal researchers and Cold War historians have made the journey there over the years. Several report the same detail, unprompted. An unusual, persistent silence in the surrounding forest, even in seasons when birdsong should fill the air. Grigory Panov, the last surviving witness to speak publicly about the events of that autumn, died in 2009. In his final interview, he was asked whether he believed Mikhail Orlov was still alive somewhere, quietly living out a life under a new name in some corner of the vast country that had swallowed him. He said he did not know. But he said one more thing, and it is the line most often quoted in the retellings of this story that circulate today. Mikhail was the only man at that station who never lied. If he said something was listening to us, then something was. No further sealed files bearing Mikhail Orlov's name have surfaced since 1992. His mother died in 1978, still writing letters to a ministry that never answered her. The dam at Kurinsk was quietly rebuilt the following year, its failure absorbed into the long uncounted ledger of Soviet industrial accidents never publicly acknowledged. And somewhere in an archive that may or may not still exist, in a drawer that may or may not have been opened again, there may be more pages, more predictions, more names, more dates not yet arrived, waiting, as Mikhail Orlov once was, for someone willing to listen.